Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 170 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. The Middle Ages is commonly thought of as a time when everyone was so religious and ignorant that they shunned science, and this especially applies to the early medieval period, the so-called Dark Ages. In reality, religion and science went hand in hand, especially where medicine was concerned. For medieval thinkers, it was necessary to understand both body and soul, how they work together, and how to care for them in order to be a good Christian and a good member of the community. This week, I spoke with Dr. Meg Leja about bodies and souls in the early Middle Ages. Meg is an assistant professor of history at Binghampton University, where she works on medicine, gender, and religion in ancient and medieval Europe. Her new book is Embodying the Soul, Medicine and Religion in Carolingian Europe. Our conversation on the relationship between bodies and souls, why people were meant to care deeply for both, and where the soul was actually thought to be located in the body is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Meg, for joining me to talk about medicine and the soul and the Carolingian period. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here and very excited to talk more with you about the Carolingians.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so when we talk about the Carolingians, just for people who are not super familiar, where and what are we talking about?
Yeah, so basically we're situated in modern day France, Germany, most of Italy, obviously lots of other countries as well, but that's kind of the area you should be thinking about. And we're talking about the mid 8th century through to the end of the 9th century is a kind of good placeholder in time.
Right. So when people are talking about Charlemagne, we're talking about pretty much dead center in the quote unquote Dark Ages, right?
That's right. Yes. A term that can incite all kinds of negative stereotypes. But yes, we are in what people would call the Dark Ages. Charlemagne around the year 800 is a good place to kind of situate this story that I'm telling in my book.
All right. So the story that you're telling in the book is about medicine and how people are thinking about medicine in terms of spirituality, in terms of their bodies, in terms of politics as well, right? So when we're talking about religion and medicine, at this time, I think a lot of people imagine these are two completely different things. Is that how it was?
Yeah, I think that people tend, in fact, beyond this period as well, to treat medicine and religion as kind of two separate stories. And we have a story where, society is dominated by religion during the Dark Ages, and then slowly science takes over and we become increasingly more and more scientific. And, medicine becomes truer and truer as we reach the 21st century. But the story is much, much more complicated. And histories of medicine often begin in the early modern period, and they don't look much before that. And when they look before that, it's often not an approach that takes religion particularly seriously, or it doesn't take religion into the picture in the full way that it should.
So when people are thinking about health, in this time of Charlemagne, around 9th century, 8th century, when they're thinking about this, they're not thinking about the body as being separate from the soul, right? So they're thinking about these things together. And how is that working out in people's minds? When they're thinking about bodies and souls, how do they work together, or do they work together at all?
Yeah. So, we tend to think of medicine as something that treats primarily the body, maybe also that treats the mind. But when we're thinking about the early Middle Ages, it's really a situation in which the soul is the entity of the individual that has priority. So if medicine is something that's going to be deemed useful in the period, it has to be something that's going to have an impact, not just on the body, but also on the soul, and primarily the health of the soul in not just a kind of physical sense, right? Not just in terms of the container of the soul, which would be the body, but also in terms of the soul's eternal health. So into the future, into the afterlife. And what I argue in my book is that in the 8th and 9th century, we're really seeing a moment where medicine is being framed as something that provides techniques to treat both the body and the soul together, and is not something that's purely confined to the physical realm, but that it also has spiritual ramifications.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to dig into that quite a lot in a second. But you were talking about the body being a container for the soul. And I didn't actually realize that people thought they figured out perhaps close to where the soul is situated in the body. So where did they think the soul was in the body?
Well, It's a very tricky question in the 8th and 9th century because they're dealing with a theological tradition that wants to argue very strongly that the soul is immaterial. And for something to be immaterial means it can't be localized in any particular place. It can't be touched. It's not tangible. You can't see it. So how can you treat it? How can you envision it? How can the soul be a container for your identity if it has this immaterial quality to it? And so in the face of this strong theological tradition, we see some pushback. And we see hints that people are suggesting, well, based on observation, perhaps the soul is located more in the head than in other parts of the body, because the head, of course, being associated with thought and the senses, that seems like a logical place. It's also the highest part of the body. So for people imagining that, God and the heavens are above the earth, the soul as above the body and the head makes a kind of sense. And another option is the blood, right? I mean, when people die, when the soul and the body separate, a clear tangible marker of that is often the loss of blood from the body and a certain amount of blood lost from the body. So the fact that the blood also runs throughout the body and the soul is thought to touch all parts of the body but be contained within it, this makes blood a kind of natural or common sense container for the soul. So it's not that the blood is the soul in Carolingian thought, but there's certainly a kind of slippage between thinking about where the blood is and where the soul might be and how the soul could be affected through medical techniques in the thought of this period.
This becomes a real place where you have to do a lot of thinking about the soul, because one of the major treatments, of course, is bloodletting. So how did that work? If you're considering that the soul might be somewhere within the blood, how does it work with bloodletting?
Right. So, I mean, there's a way of thinking about bloodletting in which it has a very negative valence, say, on the soul-body relationship. And that would be the idea that in depriving the body of blood, you are weakening the body and you're depleting it. And this does a favor to the soul because the body is always a drag on the soul. The body is a burden. It's trying to sin and the soul is trying to escape that. And so bloodletting in this sense would be seen as a way to detract from the strength of the body and thus strengthen the soul. But I argue against this in my work. I see bloodletting as being a technique that's much more about trying to manage and optimize, again, this kind of slippery container in which the soul might be held. So in this sense, bloodletting is really a way to try to purify, rebalance in this schema of the four humors, and just kind of temper and control, exert a kind of rational management over the blood, right? This crucial liquid within the body. So bloodletting in this sense becomes a technique that does not diminish the body at the expense of the soul, but rather can directly affect the kind of home of the soul, and in that sense, provide it with the ideal conditions in which to operate.
I think this is really pointing at something that maybe people perhaps don't realize, and that is that these debates are active. They're going on all the time, and it's really, really hard for anyone to pin down what any of these things are, right?
I think that is kind of the most excellent point that you could make. If there's one thing that people take away from my book, or that I also try to get across in my classes, it's that none of these ideas are settled, right? Everything is really up for debate and up for discussion. So far from a dark ages in which we have a kind of orthodoxy that comes from the top down and everyone should believe this about the soul and this about the body and this about medicine. The situation on the ground is really so distinct from that. And instead, we see people really grappling with extremely complicated ideas. I mean, ideas that we have no firm answers to, where we locate our identity, how we conceptualize a kind of spiritual component of ourselves versus a material. I mean, I certainly have come to no conclusions, and I can't say that studying the Carolingians has made me have a kind of revelation in that regard. There's just a lot of doubt, but a lot of desire at the same time to try to find some convincing answers. And so we see a lot of experimenting with thinking about, could the soul be here within the body? Could it be treated in this way? How can we respect the traditions of the past and yet also find solutions that meet our current needs. And so, right around the year 800, the Carolingians are undertaking extensive educational reforms. They're discovering and copying out all of these new texts that they're discovering in libraries and archives. And they're doing so in a script that they are inventing that is more legible. So there's a lot of intellectual activity, and we can only imagine how this spurred on new lines of inquiry, but also new answers to very long-standing problems.
It's kind of funny when you think about this, because he's absolutely trying to pin things down. He's trying to make things standardized across his empire, and it's just creating more and more questions.
Yeah, I mean, there is a push to kind of have things be standardized, to have people agree and come to some consensus on certain matters, because obviously there's a way in which that makes an empire or a kingdom run more efficiently. And you can ensure that at least the elite across the empire have some agreement on certain issues, and that will kind of trickle down to affect the rest of the population. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there is some kind of rigid enforcement of belief. I mean, within this attempt to standardize, there's still a great deal of flexibility, and there's still a great deal of openness to question, to probe, to push back, to suggest alternate avenues. So I think we absolutely see that with medicine. We see some people criticizing the copying of medical texts because they're pagan, because they might be magical, because they might suggest that humans have agency in a realm that is really God's alone. But against this, we see Carolingian authors trying to argue, no, medicine has these particular uses. It is spiritually useful. It has practical applications. It is charitable, and it should be an integral part of how we understand our Christian society.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's any sort of consensus, and we're just saying there isn't a consensus, but if there's any kind of majority, the idea from what we have surviving the Carolingian period is that medicine is a good thing. And one of the ways that they take the pagan tradition of medicine, especially from texts that we are familiar with, Galen and Hippocrates and stuff like that, how do they Christianize these? Because they do have some secret ways that they try and make this stuff more Christian, more acceptable to a Christian empire. So how are some of the ways that they are taking these texts and making them more palatable to a Christian community?
Yeah, well, so there are various different methods and techniques. One of which is, of course, just to preface what you are copying, say a particular recipe or a particular treatise on the different humors, or even a work on bloodletting, to preface that with a short paragraph that explains and states explicitly, medicine is a gift from God. It is a sacred thing. It has a great deal of utility. So we see these kinds of apologies, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, inserted at the beginning of different manuscripts or in certain sections of manuscripts. We also see images, right? There are not a ton of images in medical material from the early Middle Ages. I mean, there are a fair number of illustrations for herbs and different animals, but when it comes to other types of illustrations, there's only a handful. But the ones that we do have that survive are extremely provocative, in my opinion. They show us on a text about bloodletting and how to perform a bloodletting. So a really practically oriented text. We have a cross, we have Christ. We have Christ with seemingly blood on his cheeks, right? A reference to his own blood. So all of these potent spiritual symbols, I think, are really working here, not just to Christianize, but to endow this act of bloodletting, which is messy and smelly and not particularly pleasant, even if it has these redeeming qualities, to really endow that with a lot of theological weight, right? And someone chose to insert this image on this page and to put supplies and effort into the production of that manuscript. So I think we see this as a real choice here, again, as you're saying, to kind of Christianize the text, to shape it even in a way that an illiterate audience could potentially just see if the text were in front of them. So images, we have apologies, we have also just short very, very short phrases like amen or thanks be to God at the beginning and ends of texts, which we shouldn't ignore. They're not just there randomly. They are, again, active choices to praise God at the end of a set of medical recipes. That is something that had meaning to people and that shows us that the Carolingians are, again, framing medicine within a Christian and theological kind of agenda.
Okay, so we're bringing together religion, we're bringing together manuscripts, we're bringing together medicine and these texts. And so it seems like a good opportunity to ask, who is performing medicine at this time? I think there is the impression that it's happening only in monasteries and it's happening with like just sprinkles of holy water. So who is performing medicine at this time?
I know. And I wish I could say, this is such a great question. And I wish I could give you this thorough rundown of all of the places and clear facts and names of all of the doctors I've discovered. Unfortunately, that's not possible. I can point to very few instances of individuals who we know were practicing medicine and who were recognized within their communities as holding this title of doctor or medicus. But certainly the impression we have is that, yes, a lot of medicine is taking place in monasteries, but it's also located in many other areas outside of monasteries. And that within the monastery as well, this is hardly something that is limited to monks. It's not limited to holy water or the use of relics or the use of prayer, but in fact, monasteries are devoting likely significant resources to establishing, say, rooms devoted to bloodletting and purging, right? Bath rooms for bathing, rooms where the sick could rest and get warm with lots of heating facilities, pharmacies, so stock rooms full of herbs and other medicines. So, a really clear plan for how to provide for the sick in a practical sense as well. Okay, so we have monasteries. We also have enough instances to be sure that there are doctors that remain around the king, so at the court, and would jump in at any particular emergency, say a hunting accident, or the Carolingians, they seem to keep encountering faulty architecture where different colonnades and balconies collapse and someone is injured and who rushes in. Well, we don't hear a lot about them, but we have these brief references to the doctors coming to the king's aid. So they must have been there. Were these lay doctors? Were they bishops or priests who had trained in medicine, perhaps at a monastery? There, we really don't know because we don't know much about their background. There are also clear indications that priests, so people in local communities, local authority figures, but also people who would have had access to written texts, that they might be performing medicine, perhaps offering really basic prophylactic advice. This comes mostly from the kinds of manuscripts that we have that survive that show us, compilations of how to perform a baptism and how to perform a bloodletting or how to give dietary advice within the same collection of texts. Very, very scattered references, often in a negative vein, to women within local communities who might have dispensed kind of herbal advice. So there's a few instances where women are condemned for doing this, which suggests that it was going on. To what extent that they had access to the same kinds of recipes that we see within the literate tradition, we really don't know. But, probably there was a circulation of knowledge that went from those who were copying our most elite manuscripts, but also touched on more traditional oral remedies that were circulating within communities. And some of those may have also made their way back into the literate record that we have, in a kind of exchange that is now invisible to us, but that was probably going on at the time.
Right. So people didn't necessarily have to go and get a degree to be a doctor. You could just train, right?
Yes, this is, of course, a very important point. There's no kind of training. There's no set program of study. There's not even really a clear-cut set of texts that you would read. Although in all the descriptions of a doctor that we have from the 9th century, reading is very important. So texts are prioritized as part of a medicus's training, but there's no kind of curriculum that is supposed to be followed. So it's a very, very different situation than we see in the High Middle Ages, where we have universities, where we have faculties of medicine, where we have a clear program of study that ends in a title and a clear kind of profession. The idea of a profession is much, much looser in the early Middle Ages. But that doesn't mean that certain figures were not recognized as having medical learning and medical authority within their communities. So I think we can't forget that as well.
Mm-hmm. And as you're gesturing to right now, there starts to be literature about what a doctor should be. What should they be like? So can you tell us a little bit about what a doctor should be like?
Yeah, I have to say, this isn't entirely new literature. So a lot of these texts probably have roots in late antiquity, so much, much earlier than the Carolingians. But what is interesting is that we start to have copies of them in the 9th century. Sometimes, in fact, the first copies survive from the 9th century. And so there was a great deal, it seems, of interest in that period in describing and outlining what kind of qualities a doctor should profess. And some of these are, the kind of qualities of a good person, a good Christian. They should be moral, they should be honest, they should be chaste. That is, not having inappropriate sexual relations. They should not be greedy. They should not be angry. But some of them also bear on the kind of demeanor that a doctor should display by the bedside. So, being calm, having gravitas, having a kind of disposition that would not agitate the patient. We have descriptions of how the doctor should enter a room, how the doctor should take a patient's pulse, this kind of etiquette and procedure that might also include appearance. So, making sure that one has a tidy and neat appearance, isn't too gaudy, isn't dirty. This does not reflect our notion of hygiene, but it does reflect what an upright and respectable figure within the community might look like. And then finally, some of these descriptions also seem to incorporate really explicitly Christian values, that the doctor should serve anyone in need, should not demand payment if the person cannot afford it. So should be charitable, should praise God, should always remember that God, in fact, is the ultimate doctor, right? God is the one who ultimately provides the cures. Praise should go to God. The doctor cannot affect anything without God's help. So in that sense, these descriptions of the doctor often emphasize that he, and it's always described as a he, is a servant, right? Is a humble and loyal servant of the divine. And if he should stray from remembering that, he will no longer be probably an effective healer.
Yeah, and this gets at something that I wanted to circle around back to. So this is a good opportunity. And that is that when you have religion intersecting with what we think of as medical training, so stuff that's really intervening with the body, at this time, you have to first problem solve and see what is the cause of the sickness? Is it a bodily sickness? Is it a heavenly sickness? So is this one of the reasons why priests would make good doctors at the time?
Yes, I mean, that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, what I find more interesting is the fact that we see in some of these apologies for medicine, the idea that even if there might be a spiritual cause, that medicine can still be useful. So in other words, there isn't an attempt to exclude medicine because disease might have a spiritual root, right? That is something that a kind of detractor or a critic of medicine in the period might say, well, God sometimes sends disease as a punishment, as a just punishment for someone who has sinned, or disease can be a reminder to someone to, keep their eyes on the heavenly goal and not be distracted by worldly affairs. Disease can also act as an effective spiritual purgative, right? You can suffer now rather than suffer after death in a kind of purgatorial landscape. So, there are ways in which medicine could have been rejected because of the idea that disease can have a spiritual cause. In fact, what we see is some pushback against this and an acknowledgement that, yes, God might send disease, right? Disease might be caused by sin or might be involved in some way in a spiritual remedy, but medicine is still useful even in these cases. So people should still seek out cures. A doctor can still attempt to apply them. Yes, it might be the case that God does not send a cure in certain cases through the doctor, but this is no reason not to try. And in fact, this might seem at first kind of pessimistic, but I read it, ultimately as extremely optimistic, right? Humans have agency to intervene. They should intervene. It is right to intervene. God will not be angry at us for trying. This really elevates the human doctor in an important way, even if that doctor is not a priest, right? Even if he doesn't also hold a kind of spiritual authority to do with the sacraments.
I like that this is discussed in the book and that you've shown it to people by writing this in the book, that this discussion of praying and also having human intervention is not something that came just out of the late Middle Ages, because we do see this, around plague times as well, where people are like, we should still intervene and we will also pray. And it's really great to see you pulling out these examples from the Carolingian period, because it's obviously much, much earlier in time, but this is still something people are considering at that moment.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice comparison. Plague being a kind of absolutely horrific and hopeless event where you would assume that many people, and some I'm sure did, throw up their hands and say, we can only pray and there's nothing else we can do. As you're pointing out, we actually see a lot of attempts to try to address the plague through medical logic, to try to provide some new remedies or repurpose old remedies for this unheard of disease. And this balance of trying many different approaches at the same time is absolutely not new to the 14th century. We see this much, much earlier. We see this definitely before the Carolingians as well. But what I suggest we see in a more emphatic way in the 9th century is a kind of almost equalization of these different approaches. Like, yes, of course, prayer and relics and anointing, these are all important and valid, but medicine is not lesser than those. So medical techniques like bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary regimens, right? These all have a kind of logic grounded in human discovery of the natural world, but they also have a kind of spiritual logic to them as well. And they are not on a lesser playing field than our other healing options.
I think this is important, and it brings me to another point which I think is worth talking about, and that is, while there are a lot of religious tracts that say, you should fast and you should suffer, people also didn't think that you should suffer to the point at which you become useless. They actually didn't really think that was a great idea, even in the monastery. And some of the texts that you bring up in your book mention that people have a responsibility to take care of their bodies, especially as a seat for the soul. So how did that thinking work?
Yeah, I think another really interesting point that you raised there is fasting. And that's a good example, because fasting can have spiritual utility. And it obviously surfaces as a key kind of component of penitential regimens where you're trying to atone for sin, you're trying to wipe that sin away by not eating, by depriving your body. At the same time, we should keep in mind that fasting was actually key to many medical regimens. So, going all the way back to Hippocrates, we see fasting often incorporated into techniques that doctors would use to try to cure the body. So fasting itself is not only punitive. It's not just something that was, again, used to kind of punish the body. It was also something seen to have curative properties. So in that sense, it was something that could be used to take care of the body, as you're saying, to restore it, to bring it back to its optimal condition. So absolutely, this idea of the care of the body is something that we see really being emphasized, particularly in the decades around or just after the year 800. So there are always these examples of Christians, extreme holy men and women who go to great lengths to try to show that you don't need to take care of the body. You can absolutely deprive it of sleep, of food. You can undertake these long, long vigils and have lice in your hair and various wounds on your body. And that is what raises you up in God's eyes and the eyes of your community. We have a tendency to kind of perhaps sometimes focus on these stories for the same reason that medieval individuals did, because they strike us as, spectacular, and they really seem to embody ideas of heroism within medieval society. Against that, though, we have a perspective that is much more about the day-to-day, about the regular functioning of the individual and also of the community. And within the monastery, because there is such an emphasis on the community and the well-being of the community, many of these extreme acts are actually seen to be dangerous, right? If what you're aiming for within a Benedictine monastery is that everyone is moving according to the same schedule, you actually want the body to be regularized. And in that sense, it fits very well with a medical outlook that says, these regimens of care. If you follow these particular instructions, doing this throughout the day, doing this throughout the month, doing this according to a seasonal calendar, you will maintain the health of your body. That harmonizes very well with monastic discipline. And in this sense, the care of the body really emerges as a holy endeavor, right? As something that a good Christian should have uppermost in his or her mind. Yes, the body will be resurrected in a more perfect state, but the body on earth is still a gift from God. It was created by God at the same time that the soul was created for the individual. The two, have a journey together in life. And just as God is the caretaker of all human beings, so is the soul the caretaker of the body. And so to neglect that other component of the self is a real disservice to the act of creation.
I think that's a really important thing to talk about, because I do think that maybe perhaps in wider media, not the people who listen to this podcast, because they're already converts, but may imagine that the idea of punishing the body was so widespread that that is what everybody is doing all the time, is constantly punishing their bodies, when really most of the books that aren't saints' lives are saying that moderation is much to be preferred over any sort of asceticism.
Yes, absolutely. Moderation emerges constantly as an ideal. But I think even if, scholars have recognized that, if we talk a lot about, the pre-modern period as being one in which there is the idea of four humors and the balance of the four humors, and that's all about moderation, there is still often a tendency to depict perhaps particularly the early Middle Ages as one of these extreme holy men and women. Hagiography is such a prominent source for the period. So I would say there is this kind of stereotype. We either have the kind of barbaric warrior of the early Middle Ages who drinks a lot and, cannot contain his impulses, or we have this crazy monk or holy woman who is covered in lice and bodily sores and never sleeps and never eats. What I'm trying to show is that, yes, in fact, those ideas might exist, but a lot of the discourse is pushing both holy individuals, but also your average Christian towards a much more regulated, rationally managed kind of lifestyle.
And I think one of the points in the book that you're making too is that having a healthy body helps everyone to have a healthy empire, right? Do your part for your body so that our empire can be the best it can be. So how did that work in thought in the Carolingian Empire?
Right. I mean, there is a real emphasis on the building blocks of how you create a society. And, this has long been recognized in terms of discussions of the Carolingian Renaissance or the Carolingian Correctio. How can we reform and educate the individual so that the individual can thus be a useful component of society, but also someone who contributes to smooth functioning of these various layers or hierarchy within the kingdom? And, what I've just tried to add to that depiction is the fact that beyond the individual, or within the individual, we have a further building block, a further layer of this relationship between the body and the soul, which actually, in terms of similes and metaphors, was often conceptualized as a political or social hierarchy. So, the soul and body being compared to the king and his subjects, or a husband and wife, right? A husband ruling over his wife, or potentially even God and his human subjects. So the soul like God, the body being like human creation. So on this perhaps lowest level, we see the Carolingians really trying to think about how can we maintain stability? How can we maintain harmonious relationships between the soul and the body, just as we wish for those harmonious relationships to be reflected at various other levels of society, right? All the way from the farmer up through to the emperor, and beyond the emperor up through to God. So this understanding of kind of unity and harmony within the cosmos, or in both a elemental but also theological sense, can be brought all the way down to the components of the individual self and what constitutes any individual person. And that's a material component, the body, and a spiritual component, the soul, bipartite. And Carolingians are very clear about this. There's no three parts to the person. There's a body and a soul, and these have to work together in some way in order to be functional.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this because I really think that maybe we are not discussing this enough in terms of the quote unquote dark ages, the early middle ages, that these discussions are going on, that people are talking about them, that they're trying to figure this out. So I really appreciate that you've come on to tell us about this. And I think that the book will really help people to understand that this is a continual process throughout human history.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm always delighted when anyone is interested in learning more about the early Middle Ages or the Carolingians. And I really hope that this draws more people also to be interested in the medical material that does survive from the early Middle Ages.
To find out more about Meg's work, you can check out her Binghampton University faculty page, which we'll link to in the show notes. Her new book is Embodying the Soul, Medicine and Religion in Carolingian Europe. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website and what else is going on these days. What's going on, Peter?
Hey, we've been watching Lord of the Rings, Power of the Ring.
I think it's Rings of Power, but hey.
Is that what it is? Everyone seems to just call it Lord of the Rings. If you got your copy of Return of the King, there's a part where after you finish, there's called appendices.
Mm-hmm.
That is literally what is being used as the source material for this series. Nothing like from the Silmarillion or the Lost Tales or all the millions of other things that came out that Christopher Tolkien was kind of putting out there. This is the history and mythology that Tolkien was using.
Mm-hmm.
And as a medieval historian, I love it, actually, because he has like almost like chronicle forms. Like here in the year 1042, the elves came to Lindor.
Mm-hmm.
1586, the dwarves were at Moria.
Yeah, I will have to admit to being a bad medievalist. I don't think I ever read the appendices. I think I finished the story, the 3 books, and I don't think I read the appendices. So someone is going to revoke my medievalist card, I think.
I'm pretty sure I didn't read it on my first reading through because I was only like 13 when I read it. But I think the second time I did, like, I kind of thought, oh, this is building the mythology, right? And I think it's actually very good for like television as a basis of this because it's not too in-depth. It gives a structure to a plot and then allows the writers to kind of go forth. And I think they've made the most of it by having the Tolkien Middle-earth world in all its glory. Mm-hmm. But being able to tell their own story.
Yeah. I mean, it's a writer's dream, right? You get the skeleton and then you get to play with it as much as you want. At the same time, it's a very risky endeavor as a writer because people are so invested in this material.
Indeed. And I think most of the criticism seems to be people that are really invested in, saying, hey, this character, what have you done? Although with the characters as they speak, there's very little material to go on. They're just kind of names that did things, as opposed to having personalities. Mm-hmm. I've watched the first 3 episodes, and I think it's going to be something I'm going to enjoy. If you give it a chance, it's a very good story in itself.
I haven't caught up on the 3rd episode. But what is it that you're liking about it, Peter?
There's a big theme of friendships here and what can make a friendship. And if you've even like seen the first one, Galadriel and Elrond are friends, but it's kind of a strained and weird friendship. Elves being an odd people, I'd say. Elrond is this kind of good guy. He wants to be friends, but he's also this politician and all this leader, and it's coming up against her and her kind of single-mindedness. Mm-hmm. It's a theme that's kind of starting to repeat itself. We've got this mystery man and the hobbits, Harfoots. You've got another kind of friendship with the dwarven prince, now Elrond. Things like that, and I'm seeing that building up, and I don't want to give you some spoilers. There's some more friendships that are starting to develop in the 3rd episode.
Yeah, no spoilers. What are you thinking about the aesthetic of it?
It's beautiful what they've been able to do. Like you can see where they've poured money into making these sets. They've done a really good job. You'll love episode 3 where they set up this new land. They're really good at showcasing the beauty of this land at maybe its peak, where the elves and the dwarves and even the kingdoms of men in one case are living in kind of a splendor and opulence. So I thought it was pretty wonderful. I think there was like a couple of CGI moments on the waves that weren't, I think, particularly well done. But beyond that, really beautiful. And Another part of the world building is just how they're able to use phrases and language. I noticed that with the hobbits, they're giving them nice little phrases that you can kind of understand. It's English, but interesting kind of turns of phrase that it's nighttime or something like that. The crows are coming afoot or something like that. It's all the fun of world building, right? At the same time, trying to relate it to people today.
It's kind of an interesting thing to see this world building that was done 100 years ago and how it stacks up today. Because you do have people like the elves with their high speech, and then you have the Harfoots with their pseudo-Irish accent. It's always interesting to see how much they are going to stick to the original source material and how much they're going to stray from it, because obviously audiences now are different from the people who Tolkien was writing for.
Yeah, for certain. I think anytime you want to tell a story, you have to tell it to the audience that's going to watch it today. You can't tell it to us like historians that want to look back and say, I would love to have Tolkien as he thought of it. Well, Tolkien told this story. We can read that, but we want to explore it today. We have to kind of look it through today's eyes.
I mean, if you want to have a successful TV show, anyway.
Indeed, yeah.
I think the most ridiculous controversy is, of course, the one where people are talking about how it's not canonical to have people of different races within Middle Earth. And I just think that's always a silly argument. And especially it doesn't have any legs when you compare it to real medieval Europe or the medieval world in general. But we're not talking about the real Middle Ages. We're talking about fantasy, and you can do whatever you want in fantasy. And I certainly see no problem with having people of many different races within Tolkien. I mean, there's room for everybody, for sure, 100%.
It looks natural to me. That's what I kind of expect. It's also like, as I kind of see it in history too, why should we limit ourselves to Tolkien made this particular reference? We have to keep it to that.
Well, and as you were saying before, if it's just based on the appendices, there's space to do whatever you want with it. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree. I think so far it's been a really good series. And yeah, I think a lot more positive than Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it definitely has a more optimistic vibe, even with all of the badness that is coming down the pipe.
And more humor and just a funner watch. You can laugh and smile at places. It's not something you could do with Game of Thrones.
Not usually. So what's going on otherwise?
Well, the big news in the world right now is the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. I don't know if we'll have anything on medievalist.net about it. In ways, she is connected to the medieval past through, kings and queens of English history, but I don't know if I'll write anything about it. But, as a Canadian, sad to see her passing, the only monarch that I've ever lived under. And I just kind of wish Charles III a good reign.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting as a historian to see such a moment in your lifetime. As you said, we haven't had another queen over Canada. We haven't had another queen over the Commonwealth and the United Kingdom within our lifetime. So it is a big historical moment. And it's going to be really interesting to see that transition. Watching all of those things as a historian, what are the funeral arrangements going to be? What's the coronation going to be like? Because these are things that we have looked at quite a lot in terms of the past, many centuries ago. So it's going to be interesting to watch.
There'll be things on medievalist.net that I'm kind of thinking of writing. So we'll look back at a coronation, and I'm thinking of looking back at the coronation of Henry IV. It had a lot of controversy on its own and some really good accounts. Froissart has this wonderful account of the days, hours leading up to his coronation. And I'll also do a piece looking at why we have Elizabeth was Elizabeth II, Charles would be Charles III, like the kind of idea of numbering kings. Well, you'll find it odd that that's something that only starts up in the 14th century. I
mean, the French are always nicknaming people based on their attributes. So it's definitely safer to pick numbers.
Edward III, he's the first one to become numbered, but why does he pick 3? Because he could have literally been Edward VII, because there are Edwards in the 10th and 9th century. Why does he pick that? What is the basis of doing that? I kind of find that a really kind of interesting little bit of history. So I think I'll try and get a piece on that as well.
So is that going to be in the article? You're going to reveal the answer to that question?
Oh, I can give a spoiler. It was very much an idea of trying to think of connections with, in his case, his father and grandfather, and have that set up. And then the idea was William The first, starts a whole new line. They're trying to trace themselves back to that. I'll go in more depth into it. I have to kind of go back into the books I read. Robert Bartlett is what I'm basing it on, and he's a wonderful historian. So I have to kind of take a look at his stuff again.
Well, I was thinking this was more of a project of really connecting Edward III to France, which he was trying to take power over at the time. And if you can pull yourself back to the Normans, well, that's a great idea.
That's true.
So anything else coming up on the website you want to tell us about?
We've got a couple more pieces on the Abbasid Civil War and the tale of Harold Hardrada, and even the movie review.
All right. Well, thanks, Peter. And we will catch up with you next week.
Thanks.
As always, a big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast through medievalist.net's page at patreon.com. Patrons can enjoy subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. Your patronage supports my work and the work of others who contribute amazing content to medievalist.net. So, thank you. To become a patron, check out patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from souls to rolls, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. You can also find my new digital downloads at daniellecebulski.com/shop. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.